There is a file I have kept in a locked drawer for almost 2 years. Not because the account inside it is complicated. It is actually devastatingly simple. But because every time I open it, something in my chest tightens in a way that doesn't loosen until long after I close it again. Tonight, I am opening it. The case belongs to a woman I will call Margaret, 51 years old, daughter of a man who spent 30 years building something he thought was unbreakable. His name, his fortune, his silence, and for 12 of those years, she let him keep the silence. So did she. 2 people who shared the same blood and hadn't exchanged a single word in over a decade. Not because neither of them could speak, but because pride, the particular, suffocating kind that grows slowly in families where love was never said plainly, had grown taller than both of them. I have archived nearly 40 accounts in this collection. Few have landed with the specific weight of this one. Not because the miracle is the most dramatic, though it is well documented, but because the estrangement itself is such a universal, private wound, the kind no one mentions at Sunday Mass, but almost everyone carries. Margaret told me, when we finally spoke, that she had recited the same memoir for 12 consecutive years, every single morning before her feet touched the floor. Not asking for her father's forgiveness specifically, just asking, quietly, stubbornly, with the kind of faith that doesn't announce itself, to be shown what to do when the time came. She never knew the time would come the way it did, with a hospice nurse's phone call, with 2 weeks given by a team of physicians as a clinical estimate, and with a room at the end of a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and something older. Something that reminded her, she said, of the inside of the church where she was baptized. If that detail catches you, stay with it, because that detail matters. And if this account is already pressing something in you that you recognize, leave a word in the comments. You will not be the first. The formal record begins 4 days before Margaret arrived at that facility. Her father, a man named Bernard, had been under palliative assessment for 9 days at that point. The hospice team, 3 physicians, a clinical coordinator, and a licensed palliative care nurse, had completed their intake documentation and signed their findings collectively. The record reads plainly: Stage 4, cardiac and pulmonary failure, bilateral edema, cognitive lucidity described as intermittent and declining. Pain management had been adjusted twice in 72 hours. There was no curative path available. The language in the chart is worth noting, not because it is cruel, but because it is precise. Dr. Elaine Farrow, the senior attending on record, stated the following during the family consultation: "We are no longer measuring in weeks. We are measuring in days. And I want to be clear with you about what that means for your planning." That sentence. It was said professionally, charitably even, and it was accurate according to every measurable clinical indicator available to that team at that moment. What the ledger records is not a failure of medicine. What it records is the precise location where medicine reached its own boundary, the edge of the mapped territory, and stopped. What happened past that boundary is the reason this file exists. Those of you who have walked with this channel for any length of time know that when the instruments run out of road, that is precisely where the account begins to get interesting. Tonight's record is no different. You have been in rooms like that. Maybe not that specific room, but a version of it. The fluorescent light that is always slightly too bright. The chair beside the bed that no one sits in comfortably. The sound of equipment that runs in steady intervals and registers nothing on your face, but registers everything in your body. You know that feeling. The one where every rational argument you have ever assembled simply stops working. Where you look at the person in the bed and you do not see the fight that separated you. You see a folded cane leaning against the wall. You see a photograph on the nightstand, small, framed in something cheap. And in it, you are maybe 8 years old, and his arm is around you, and whatever happened later had not happened yet. That is where Margaret stood when she walked into that room. 12 years of silence, and the cane, and the photograph, and the monitor marking his pulse in intervals that had grown longer each hour. She had not planned what to say. She had driven 4 hours. She had not eaten, almost turned around 3 times on that highway. 3 times. Each time, she kept driving anyway. She sat beside him for a long time before he knew she was there. His eyes, when they opened, did not immediately register recognition. The nurses had warned her about that. And in those first few seconds, she had the strange experience of watching someone she loved so completely not see her at all. She reached for his hand. He let her. She didn't speak right away. She told me she couldn't find the words. Not because they weren't there, but because every sentence she had rehearsed for 12 years sounded, in that room, like the wrong instrument for the occasion. So she just sat. And then she noticed something she had not been told about, tucked beneath the edge of his pillow, visible only because the housekeeping staff had shifted it slightly. A St. Jude medal, worn, the kind worn through years of handling, not years of display. The same medal, she realized, with the particular shock of a memory arriving without warning, that she had pressed into his palm at her mother's funeral, 22 years earlier. He had never mentioned it. She had never asked. She had assumed, as we assume so many things in family silence, that it had been lost or discarded or forgotten. It had not been forgotten. She held his hand and closed her eyes and said the only thing that felt honest. She said, "I'm here." And then, very quietly, the way you do when you are speaking to something larger than the room, she said, "I can't do this alone. Neither can he. You know that already." Those of you who hold this kind of traditional faith, quietly and without apology, you understand what that prayer was. Not a performance, a surrender. If this account is moving you toward something you have been postponing, a call you haven't made, a silence you haven't broken, let that feeling stay with you tonight. Subscribe to Miracle Ledger and activate the notification so that when the next account comes, it finds you ready. The next part of this record is the one I have read the most carefully, and the one I keep coming back to. What the medical record documents between 2:47 in the morning and 4:15 is as follows. Bernard's oxygen saturation, which had been declining in a measured pattern consistent with the team's prognosis, registered an anomaly at 2:49. A stabilization that the night nurse on duty noted in the chart as unexpected but not yet clinically significant. By 3:17, it had not declined further. By 4:02, it had improved by a measurable margin that the attending physician, when reached by phone, asked the nurse to re-verify with a second device. The reading was confirmed. His breathing, which had been labored and shallow, had shifted in quality, not dramatically, but observably. The lead physician's note, entered at 6:45 that morning, contains a phrase I want to read to you carefully. Presentation inconsistent with trajectory documented at intake. Cause not yet established. Reassessment ordered. Every intervention that team had available, every medication, every adjustment, every protocol, had already been deployed before 2:47. There was nothing left in their toolbox. The stabilization preceded nothing they had done in the previous 6 hours. Margaret had not moved from that chair. She had not stopped holding the medal. Think about what you are watching here. Not with sentiment, with precision. You are watching a room where a team of trained clinicians, working from the best available evidence, had reached what they called an endpoint. They had done everything the architecture of their discipline permitted. And then you are watching that endpoint quietly dissolve in the hours following a private act of intercession. Pride, the institutional variety, the kind that wears credentials and speaks in prognoses, has a particular sound when it runs out of answers. It goes very quiet. And in that quiet, something else enters. The attending physician, Dr. Farrow, who had spoken those words about days rather than weeks, came into the room that morning and stood at the foot of the bed for a long time without saying anything. Margaret told me she watched her. The doctor finally said, "I want to be honest with you. I do not have a clinical explanation for what I am looking at." That is not a small statement from a person in her position. That is someone standing at the boundary of their map and acknowledging the territory past it. And if you carry the faith that tells you, grace always finds the fracture, you already understand what had happened in the hours before she walked in. The link in the description carries the full documented case reference for those who want to read the primary record. He was awake and coherent the following afternoon, not fully recovered. That is not what this account claims, but present, lucid, looking at her with the kind of recognition that requires no medical explanation. She told me the apology came out of him in pieces, the way things come out of people who have never practiced saying them. He didn't use large words. He didn't construct an argument. He said her name first, just her name, the way he had said it when she was small. And then he said, "I kept it because I didn't know how to tell you I was still asking." He meant the medal. He had been carrying a prayer for 12 years too, just in a different shape, in a different kind of silence, behind a wall that had been built one unspoken year at a time. She put the medal back under his pillow. She told me that afterward, she sat in the hospital chapel for nearly an hour, not crying, just still, the way you are still when something enormous has shifted, and your body knows it before your mind does. The priest she found in that chapel asked if she needed anything. She told him, no. And then she said, "Actually, yes. Can we say the memorare together?" They did. That is the detail this file ends on. Not the medical chart, not the physician's statement. Two people saying an old prayer in a small room, and the particular quality of peace that settled in the space between the words. This account was formally archived on the 14th of February of this year. The documentation includes Bernard's medical record, the nursing chart notations from that night, Dr. Farrow's written reassessment, and Margaret's own sealed written testimony, submitted 3 months after her father was discharged from hospice care. Discharged, not transferred. Discharged. What the record asks of anyone who reads it is not credulity. It is honesty, the honest acknowledgement that there are outcomes which fall outside the edges of what human authority can account for, and that when those outcomes cluster around a specific act of devotion, around a worn medal in a private prayer, said in the dark, the intellectually serious response is not dismissal, it is reckoning. The ledger reminds us that human pride builds high walls, but grace always finds the fracture. This record is officially unsealed, but the unexplained, as it always does, remains alive. If this account touched something in you that you want to keep, Share it with someone who needs to hear that no estrangement is beyond reach, no hospital corridor is too far for intercession, and no cause, however the experts have labeled it, is ever truly final. The next file is already waiting.